The metal walls of the interrogation room reflected the cold blue light that filled every corner of the Galactic Coalition vessel. Commander Thane sat across from the human prisoner, his purple skin showing the calm patterns that his people displayed. When they felt in control, his 6 fingers tapped quietly on the smooth table surface as he studied the creature before him. Dr. Marcus Reed looked tired. His brown hair had grown long during his months in captivity, and his blue eyes seemed older than his 43 years. The human wore the standard gray prisoner clothing, but he sat straight in his chair, did not look defeated. Thane had questioned hundreds of prisoners from dozens of different species during his 30 years of military service. Most followed predictable patterns. They either broke down quickly and told him everything, or they stayed silent and revealed nothing. Humans seemed different, but Thane could not yet understand how. "Dr. Reed," Thane began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used with all prisoners. "You have been cooperative during your time here. Your medical knowledge has helped our doctors treat both human and alien injuries. For this, you have our gratitude." Reed nodded but said nothing. His hands rested calmly on the table. However, Thane continued, "There are still questions about human military capabilities that remain unanswered. Your species fought against overwhelming odds during the integration conflicts. Our analysts cannot understand how humans achieved several impossible victories against superior forces." The human doctor tilted his head slightly. "What do you want? To know? Your tactical approach makes no logical sense," Thane said, leaning forward. "Time after time, human forces continued fighting when any reasonable species would have surrendered. You suffered massive casualties, but kept fighting. You lost battles, but somehow won wars. Our military scientists need to understand this behavior." Reed was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "You think we're crazy?" "Not crazy," Thane replied carefully. "Perhaps illogical." A small smile crossed Reed's face. "Commander, may I ask you something?" Thane gestured for him to continue. "In your military training, what do you do when the odds of victory drop below acceptable levels?" "We retreat to regroup and find a better tactical position," Thane answered. Without hesitation, preservation of forces is always the primary concern. And if retreat is impossible, then we negotiate surrender terms that minimize further casualties. Reed nodded slowly. "That makes perfect sense. It's logical, efficient, and saves lives. Your people have built a successful civilization using those principles." "Yes," Thane agreed. "So why do humans act differently?" "'Cause," Reed said quietly, "we don't calculate odds the same way you do." The human doctor leaned back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling. "Commander, do you really want to understand human warfare?" "That is why we are here." Reed looked back at Thane, and the alien commander saw something shift in the human's expression. The tired man seemed to straighten slightly, and his eyes became more focused. "Then let me tell you about the siege of Fortress Delta," Reed said. Thane reached for his recording device, but Reed held up a hand. "You won't need that," the human said. "You'll remember every word." The commander paused, then settled back to listen. Fortress Delta was a military research station built into the side of a mountain in what used to be called Colorado, Reed began. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just concrete and steel carved into rock, with a few communication towers and landing pads. Most people didn't even know it existed. Reed's voice took on a distant quality, as if he was seeing the place in his mind. "I was stationed there as head of medical services. We had about 200 soldiers and 50 civilians. Scientists, engineers, medical staff, support personnel. It was supposed to be a safe posting, far from any fighting." Thane found himself leaning forward slightly. There was something in the human's tone that suggested this story would not have a simple ending. The war was going badly for Earth, Reed continued. "We all knew it. The automated forces that attacked us were too numerous, too well coordinated. Our cities were falling one by one. But Fortress Delta was deep in the mountains, hidden, unimportant. We thought we would be safe." The human paused and looked directly at Thane. "We were wrong." Reed described how the attack began on a Tuesday morning. Automated aircraft had appeared over the mountain peaks like a dark cloud, followed by ground units that moved through the forest like metal insects. Within hours, Fortress Delta was completely surrounded.
Ow.
Our commanding officer, Colonel Davis, tried to establish communication with the outside world, Reed said. But the enemy had jammed all our signals. We were cut off completely. No way to call for help. No way to let anyone know what was happening, Thane interrupted. What were your defensive capabilities? Limited, Reed admitted. We had some automated defense systems, enough weapons for the soldiers, and walls built into the mountain. But we were a research station, not a combat fortress. We were not prepared for a siege. The human doctor continued his story, describing the first day of the attack. The automated forces had not tried to storm the fortress immediately. Instead, they had taken positions around the mountain and waited. That was when we realized what they were doing, Reed said. They weren't in a hurry. They knew we couldn't escape, couldn't call for help. They were going to wait until our supplies ran out, then take the fortress without a fight. Thane nodded. Logical strategy. Minimize their losses while ensuring victory. Exactly, Reed agreed. And if we had been any other species, it probably would have worked. The alien commander felt a strange chill at those words, though he could not understand why. Reed looked down at his hands. Colonel Davis called a meeting that first night. All department heads, senior staff, anyone with experience. We reviewed our situation. Food for maybe 2 weeks if we rationed carefully. Water for longer, thanks to the underground springs. Ammunition for perhaps one major engagement. Medical supplies for basic care only. The human raised his eyes to meet Thane's gaze again. The colonel asked each of us for our assessment. Everyone agreed the situation was hopeless. We could not win. We could not escape. Logic said we should negotiate surrender. Thane waited for Reed to continue, but the human remained silent for several long moments. And the commander, finally, asked. Reed smiled, but it was not a happy expression. Then someone asked the question that changed everything. Commander Thane found himself holding his breath as he waited for Reed to continue. The human doctor sat quietly for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. The question came from Lieutenant Rodriguez, a young woman who worked in communications. Reed said she was maybe 25 years old, fresh out of training. She looked around that room full of senior officers and experienced soldiers, and she asked, "What if surrender isn't an option?" Thane frowned. "But surrender is always an option when facing impossible odds." "That's what Colonel Davis said," Reed replied. He explained that the automated forces would likely treat prisoners according to standard protocols. Some of us might survive in captivity. It was the logical choice. The human leaned forward slightly, but Rodriguez shook her head. She said she had been monitoring enemy communications before the jamming started. The automated forces weren't taking prisoners anywhere else. They were eliminating all human presence from captured areas. Reed paused to let this information settle. That room went very quiet, he continued. We all understood what that meant. There would be no negotiation, no surrender terms, no prisoner exchanges. The enemy intended to kill everyone in the fortress regardless of what we did. Thane felt his skin. Patterns shift to show confusion. If defeat was certain either way, why not surrender immediately and hope for mercy? Reed looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Commander, you still don't understand. Once we knew that surrender meant death, the entire situation changed. We weren't choosing between victory and defeat anymore. We were choosing between dying on our knees or dying on our feet." The alien officer tried to process this logic, but the outcome is the same. "No," Reed said firmly. "The outcome is completely different." The human doctor began describing what happened next. Colonel Davis had given everyone 12 hours to think about their situation. He told them they could try to sneak away individually if they wanted. Some of the civilian staff might be able to hide in the mountains until the siege ended. "Many chose to leave?" Thane asked. 3, Reed said. 3 people out of 250? A young engineer, a maintenance worker, and one of the scientists. We gave them supplies and wished them luck. They slipped out through a service tunnel that night. Reed's voice became quieter. We found their bodies 2 days later.
The automated
Forces had motion sensors covering every possible escape route. But at least those 3 had tried to live, The rest of us had decided something different. Thane leaned forward. What did you decide? We decided that if we were going to die, we would make it cost them everything they had, the human described. The first week of the siege, the automated forces had settled into positions around the fortress and begun a patient bombardment. They used energy weapons to target the external defenses and communication equipment, but they did not try to break through the main walls. They were being careful, Red explained. The fortress contained research data they wanted intact. They applied just enough pressure to keep us pinned down while they waited for hunger and thirst to do their work. Reed told Thane about the rationing system they established. Food that should have lasted 2 weeks was stretched to cover a month. Water consumption was cut to the absolute minimum. Medical supplies were cataloged and reserved for only the most serious injuries. The hardest part wasn't the hunger, Reed said, it was watching people change. He described how the soldiers had volunteered for the most dangerous duties without being asked. How the civilian engineers had worked around the clock to strengthen defenses and create new weapons from spare parts. How the research scientists had focused their efforts on finding weaknesses in the enemy's automated systems. Everyone found a way to contribute, Reed continued. The kitchen staff learned to make meals from things that barely qualified as food. The maintenance crew figured out how to keep our power running with failing equipment. Even the youngest personnel took on responsibilities far beyond their training. Thane listened with growing unease as Reed described the daily routine of life. Under siege, people working 18-hour shifts, sleeping in shifts so that defenses were always manned, sharing everything they had without complaint. On day 8, we lost our first person to enemy fire, Reed said. Private Wilson was checking the perimeter sensors when a sniper got him. He was 19 years old. The human doctor paused, and Thane could see pain in his eyes. That night, Colonel Davis asked for volunteers for a dangerous mission to recover Wilson's body. Every single person in the fortress raised their hand. Thane felt his skin patterns shift again. This behavior made no logical sense. Why risk more lives for someone already dead? Reed looked at him steadily, because leaving him out there would have meant the enemy won something from us? Couldn't allow that. The human continued his story, describing how 12 volunteers had crawled through tunnels and maintenance shafts to reach Wilson's position. They had recovered his body and made it back with only one additional injury. That was when I began to understand what was happening to us, Reed said. We weren't just fighting the enemy anymore. We were fighting the idea that humans could be broken. Reed told Thane about the second week, when food supplies dropped to dangerously low levels. People had begun losing weight rapidly, but morale remained high. They had established a system where everyone contributed whatever skills they had to the common defense. The research scientists had found a weakness in the enemy's communication system, Red explained. The engineers figured out how to exploit it. Soldiers planned how to use the information. Everyone worked together. Thane interrupted. What kind of weakness? The automated forces relied on constant communication with their command units, Reed said. We could disrupt that communication at the right moment. We might be able to create confusion in their ranks. The alien commander nodded. This seemed like reasonable tactical thinking. But creating the disruption would require someone to get very close to their positions, Reed continued, like close enough that they probably wouldn't survive the mission. Thane waited for the human to explain who had been chosen for this suicide mission. We had to hold a lottery, Reed said quietly. Too many people volunteered. The alien felt his breathing become shallow. Lottery. 73 people wanted to take the mission, Reed explained, including me, including civilians who had never fired a weapon in their lives, including wounded soldiers who could barely walk. Reed described the lottery system they had used. Names drawn from a container, with the understanding that whoever was chosen would probably die in the attempt. The winner was a communications specialist named Thompson, Reed said. She was 28 years old, married with 2 children. Back on Earth? Thane found himself asking a question he immediately regretted. How did she react to being chosen? Reed smiled, and this time it was a real smile, full of pride and sadness. She said it was the greatest honor of her life. Commander Thane realized his hands were trembling slightly as Reed continued his story. The alien officer tried to understand how an entire group of beings could volunteer for certain death, but the concept remained beyond his grasp. Thompson's mission was scheduled for day 15, Reed said. But before she could attempt it, everything went wrong. The human doctor explained how the automated forces had changed their tactics. Instead of waiting patiently for starvation to win the siege, they had begun using chemical weapons to contaminate the fortress's water supply. We didn't realize what was happening at first, Reed continued. People started getting sick, stomach problems, dizziness, weakness. I thought it was just malnutrition from the rationing. Reed described how the contamination had spread through their water systems. Within 2 days, half the fortress was ill. Within a week, almost everyone was affected to some degree. That was when I had to make the hardest decision of my life, Reed said quietly. Thane waited, though part of him no longer wanted to hear what came next. Our medical supplies were nearly gone, Reed explained. I had basic medicines for maybe 20 people, but over 100 were sick. Some were dying. The human doctor looked down at his hands. I had to choose who would get treatment and who wouldn't. Thane felt his stomach clench. This was a situation he hoped never to face himself. How did you choose? He asked. Reed met his eyes. I didn't. They chose themselves. The alien commander frowned. I don't understand. When I announced that we only had enough medicine for 20 people, I expected arguments, maybe fights, Reed said. Instead, every single sick person refused treatment. Thane's skin patterns shifted to show deep confusion. They refused medical care, every one of them, Reed confirmed. They said the medicine should go to the people who were still healthy, to keep them fighting as long as possible. The human described scenes that made Thane's mind reel. Soldiers vomiting from poisoning, but still manning their posts. Engineers collapsing from weakness, but continuing to work on defensive systems. Civilians sharing their meager food rations with people who were sicker than they were. I had to watch people die because they wouldn't let me treat them, Reed said, his voice breaking slightly. Good people, brave people, who thought everyone else deserved life more than they did. Reed told Thane about Private Martinez, a young soldier who had been guarding the main entrance. The poison had hit him harder than most, and he was clearly dying. But he had refused to leave his post. I went to him on day 21, Reed said. He was so weak he could barely hold his weapon, but he was still at his station, I told him. He needed medical attention. Reed paused, and Thane could see the memory was painful. Martinez looked at me and said, Doc, if I leave this post, who's going to watch the door? I told him we could find someone else. He shook his head and said, Everyone else has a more important job than I do. The human doctor wiped his eyes. Martinez died at his post 6 hours later. We found him still gripping his rifle, still watching the entrance. Thane tried to process this information. In his military experience, soldiers who were dying were relieved of duty and given medical care. The idea of someone choosing to die at their post rather than seek treatment was incomprehensible. The poisoning changed everything, Reed continued. We lost 37 people in 10 days. Our fighting strength was cut in half. The automated forces knew what they had done, and they began preparing for a final assault. Reed described how the remaining survivors had adapted to their new reality. With so many people sick or dead, everyone had to take on multiple responsibilities. The kitchen staff learned to operate defensive systems. Scientists took shifts as guards. Medical personnel worked as engineers. I found myself doing things I never thought I would do, Reed said. I performed surgery with tools made from kitchen knives, treated infections with cleaning chemicals. I learned to shoot a rifle because we needed every person who could hold a weapon. The human told Thane about the morning of day 25, when their automated defense systems finally failed. The fortress was now protected only by the people inside it, and many of those people could barely stand. Colonel Davis called another meeting, Reed said. This time only 48 people were healthy enough to attend. He told us the situation was hopeless. The enemy would attack within hours, and we had no chance of stopping them. Thane leaned forward. Did anyone suggest surrender? Reed shook his head. No one even mentioned it. The question was how to make our last stand count for something. The human described the planning session that followed. With their defensive systems down and their numbers reduced, they had only one advantage left. The enemy still wanted the research data intact. We decided to use that against them, Reed explained. If they wanted the fortress, they would have to come inside to get it. And once they were inside, we could make them pay for every room, every corridor, every inch of ground. Reed told Thane about the preparations they made. Explosive devices created from medical supplies and maintenance chemicals. Barricades built. From furniture and equipment, weapons distributed to everyone who could hold them, including people who had never fought before in their lives. The night before the final attack, I couldn't sleep, Reed said. I walked through the fortress, checking on people. What I saw will stay with me forever. The human described finding a young engineer named Lisa working on a booby trap for one of the corridors. She was so weak from the poisoning that she could barely keep her eyes open, but she was still working. I asked her why she wasn't resting, Reed said. She looked up at me and said, because if I don't finish this tonight, someone else will have to do it tomorrow, and they might not have time. Reed found similar scenes throughout the fortress, people working through the night despite illness and exhaustion, preparing for a battle they knew they would not survive. In the medical bay, I found 3 wounded soldiers who could barely walk, Reed continued. They were practicing with their weapons, trying to figure out how to fight from wheelchairs and stretchers. The human's voice became very quiet. I asked one of them, a sergeant named Foster, why he wasn't focusing on recovery. He had taken shrapnel in both legs and would never walk normally again, but he was determined to fight. Reed paused, gathering himself. Foster looked at me like I had asked a stupid question. He said, Doc, tomorrow, those machines are going to try to kill my friends. Do you really think I'm going to let them do that while I'm still breathing? Thane felt something cold settle in his chest. He was beginning to understand that humans did not calculate survival the same way his people did. The attack began at dawn on day 26, Reed said. We were as ready as we could be. The human looked directly at Thane. What happened next will explain everything you need to know about human warfare. Commander Thane noticed that his breathing had become shallow as Reed prepared to describe the final battle. The alien officer had listened to countless combat reports during his military career, but something about this human's story felt different. More personal, more real. The automated forces began their assault with a coordinated bombardment, Reed said, his voice taking on the steady tone of someone recounting technical details. They had brought heavy weapons to break through our outer defenses. The mountain shook with each impact. Reed described how the defenders had waited in their prepared positions. 48 people, many of them sick or wounded, scattered throughout a fortress built for 10 times that number. Colonel Davis had positioned everyone according to a plan we called the spiral, Reed explained. Instead of defending the perimeter and falling back room by room, we would let the enemy penetrate deep into the fortress, then attack them from behind. Thane frowned. You allowed the enemy to enter your stronghold? We invited them in, Reed corrected. The outer sections of the fortress were rigged with explosives, but we didn't detonate them during the initial assault. We wanted the automated forces to think we were retreating. The human told Thane how the first wave of attackers had breached the main entrance without significant resistance. The automated units had advanced quickly through the outer corridors, expecting to find desperate humans making a last stand. What they found instead were empty rooms and abandoned positions, Reed said. We had pulled back to the intersections and waited. Reed described the moment when Colonel Davis had given the signal to begin the real fight. The explosives in the outer sections detonated simultaneously, trapping the first wave of attackers inside the fortress and preventing reinforcements from entering. The automated forces suddenly found themselves fighting in a maze, Reed explained. They were designed for open combat, not close-quarters fighting in damaged buildings. They were separated from their command units outside. Thane began to understand the tactical brilliance of the plan. You turned their strength into a weakness. Exactly, Reed confirmed. But the plan only worked because of what happened next. The human described how the defenders had emerged from their hiding places to attack the trapped automated forces. Small groups of humans moving through maintenance tunnels and service corridors, striking quickly and then disappearing. I was. With a team led by Sergeant Foster, Reed said, the same man who insisted on fighting from his wheelchair. He couldn't walk, but he could still shoot, and he knew every inch of the fortress layout. Reed told Thane about Foster's team. 3 wounded soldiers, 2 sick engineers, and 1 doctor with no combat training. They had been assigned to clear the medical section of automated intruders. We found 12 enemy units searching the medical bay, Reed continued. Foster developed a plan on the spot. The engineers would create a distraction while the soldiers attacked from 2 directions. I was supposed to stay hidden and treat any wounded. The human paused, and Thane could see the memory was difficult. Plan went wrong immediately. One of the engineers, a woman named Roberts, was spotted while setting up the distraction. The automated units opened fire on her position. Reed described what happened next in careful detail. Roberts had been hit multiple times, but was still alive. The enemy units were advancing on her position, and Foster's team could not reach her in time. That was when Roberts did something that saved all our lives, Reed said quietly. She was dying, but she still had the detonator for the explosive charges we had planted in the medical bay. Thane waited, though he was beginning to dread what came next. Roberts triggered the explosives while she was still in the blast radius, Reed said. She killed herself to take out the automated units that were about to kill the rest of us. The alien commander felt his skin patterns shift to show deep distress. Suicide attacks were known in galactic warfare, but they were usually acts of desperation or fanaticism. This sounded different. She sacrificed herself to save her team, Thane said, trying to understand. No, Reed corrected. She sacrificed herself to complete the mission. There's a difference. Reed continued his account of the battle, describing how similar scenes played out throughout the fortress. Humans using themselves as weapons when their equipment failed. Wounded soldiers crawling through ventilation shafts to plant explosives. Civilians with no military training taking on roles that professional soldiers would find challenging. Fighting lasted for 8 hours, Reed said. By the end, we had destroyed most of the automated forces that entered the fortress, but the cost was terrible. The human told Thane about the casualties. Of the 48 defenders who began the final battle, only 11 were still alive when the shooting stopped. 7 of those were wounded so badly, they could not continue fighting. I was one of the wounded, Reed admitted. Shrapnel from an explosion had torn up my left leg and arm. I could barely move, let alone fight. Reed described the aftermath of the battle. The fortress was heavily damaged, with entire sections collapsed or destroyed. The remaining defenders were scattered throughout the ruins, most of them injured and all of them exhausted. That should have been the end, Reed said. We had won the battle, but we were in no condition to fight another one. The automated forces outside were preparing for a second assault. Thane leaned forward. How many enemy units remained? Best estimate was around 1,500, Reed replied, against 4 humans who could still fight effectively. The alien commander shook his head. Impossible odds. That's what I thought too, Reed agreed. But I had underestimated the people I was fighting alongside. Reed told Thane about the conference held among the survivors. Colonel Davis had been killed in the fighting, along with most of the senior officers. Leadership fell to Sergeant Foster, the man who had been fighting from a wheelchair. Foster gathered everyone who could still speak, Reed said. All 11 survivors, some of them barely conscious. He asked for ideas about what to do next. The human described the discussion that followed. Their numbers reduced to almost nothing and their defenses destroyed. Conventional military thinking suggested they should either hide and hope to avoid detection or surrender and hope for mercy. But nobody suggested either of those options, Reed continued. Instead, they started planning how to attack the enemy forces outside the fortress. Thane felt his mind struggling to process this information. Attack? With 4 combat-effective personnel? That's what I said, Reed replied. I pointed out that we were outnumbered hundreds to 1, that most of us were wounded, that we had limited ammunition and no heavy weapons. Reed paused, and Thane could see a strange expression cross the human's face. Foster listened to my objections, then asked me a simple question. Doc, Do you think those machines outside are expecting us to attack them? The human continued his story, describing how the survivors had spent the night preparing for an assault that defied all logic. They had gathered every remaining weapon, every explosive device, every piece of equipment that could be used as a weapon. The plan was insane, Reed said. We would sneak out through the service tunnels, position ourselves around the enemy camp, and attack from all directions simultaneously. Reed told Thane about the hours before the attack. Wounded humans crawling through tunnels in the darkness, carrying improvised weapons and homemade explosives. People who should have been in medical care instead, preparing for a battle they could not possibly win. I asked Foster why we were doing this, Reed said. He was so weak he could barely hold his rifle, but his eyes were completely clear when he answered, and waited for the response, though part of him no longer wanted to hear it. Foster said, because if we don't try, then everyone who died defending this place died for nothing. And I won't let that happen. Reed described the attack itself. For humans, and 7 wounded survivors emerging from the darkness to assault a force of 1,500 automated units. Using surprise, desperation, and intimate knowledge of the terrain to achieve what should have been impossible, we destroyed their command center in the first 5 minutes, Reed said. Without central coordination, the automated units began operating independently. That made them vulnerable to the kind of hit-and-run tactics we were using. The human told Thane about the running battle that followed. Humans appearing from shadows to attack isolated enemy units, then disappearing before reinforcements could arrive, using the forest and mountain terrain to offset their numerical disadvantage. The battle lasted for 3 days, Reed said. The end. We had eliminated every automated unit in the area. Thane stared at the human doctor. 11 people defeated 1,500 automated soldiers. 4 people, Reed corrected quietly. We lost 7 more during the fighting. Only 4 of us lived to see the rescue ships arrive. The alien commander felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. For survivors out of 250, he said. Reed nodded. For survivors who held Fortress Delta for 31, Dazen destroyed a force 20 times larger than the original garrison. Thane sat in silence for a long moment, trying to understand what he had just heard. How? He finally asked. Commander Thane sat motionless in his chair, staring at Dr. Reed. The human story had ended. But the alien officer felt as though something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the universe. His purple skin showed patterns of deep confusion and distress. How? Thane repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Reed looked at him with those tired blue eyes that seemed to hold depths the alien commander was only beginning to comprehend. You're asking the wrong question, Reed said gently. The question isn't how we won. The question is why we fought. Thane shook his head slowly. I don't understand the difference. Your people calculate the odds of success before committing to a course of action, Reed explained. When the odds become unfavorable, you retreat or surrender. It's logical, efficient, and saves lives. The human leaned forward slightly. Humans don't work that way. We don't fight because we think we can win. We fight because some things are more important than winning. Thane felt his breathing become irregular. More important than survival. Much more important, Reed confirmed. At Fortress Delta, we weren't fighting to survive. We were fighting to prove that humans could not be broken. The alien commander tried to process this concept, but it went against everything he had learned about rational behavior.
But if you
die, what does it matter what you proved? Reed smiled sadly. Commander, do you have children? Yes, Thane replied automatically. To offspring? If someone threatened to kill your children, what would you do? I would negotiate for their safety, Thane said. I would offer whatever the attacker wanted in exchange for their lives, and if the attacker refused to negotiate, if they intended to kill your children regardless of what you offered, Thane felt his skin patterns shift to show deep discomfort. I would try to find another solution. But what if there was no other solution? Reed pressed. What if the only choice was to fight someone stronger than you, knowing you would probably lose? The alien commander was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke in a voice that sounded uncertain even to himself. I suppose ... I would fight even knowing you would likely die. Yes, Reed nodded. Today. Then you understand the beginning of human warfare. The human doctor stood up and walked to the small window in the interrogation room. He looked out at the stars visible beyond the ship's hull. Every person at Fortress Delta was fighting for something bigger than themselves, Reed said. The soldiers were fighting for their duty and their comrades. The civilians were fighting for their families back on Earth. I was fighting for the idea that people should help each other, even when it costs them everything. Reed turned back to face Thane. We knew we were going to die. We accepted that from the first day, but we also knew that how we died would matter. If we gave up, if we surrendered without fighting, then every other human facing impossible odds would have one less example of what people could accomplish when they refused to quit. Thane felt something cold spreading through his chest. Got you. Fought to inspire others? We fought because that's what humans do, Reed corrected. We don't give up when the odds are bad. We don't surrender when someone stronger tells us to. We don't stop fighting just because logic says we should. Human returned to his chair and sat down across from Thane. Commander, your people have built a successful civilization by being reasonable. You calculate risks, minimize losses, and preserve your resources for fights you can win. It's a good strategy for a species that wants to survive and prosper. Reed paused and his expression became serious. But it's also a strategy that depends on your enemies being reasonable too. What happens when you face an opponent who doesn't care about odds, who won't negotiate, who keeps fighting even when they're dying? Thane felt his hands beginning to tremble again. He was starting to understand the implications of what Reed was telling him. You're saying humans will never surrender? I'm saying humans will surrender when it makes sense to surrender, Reed replied. But we define making sense differently than you do. For us, surrender has to preserve something we value more than our own lives. The human told Thane about the rescue ships that had arrived at Fortress Delta on day 32. The 4 survivors had been found in the ruins of the fortress, barely alive, but still manning their defensive positions. The rescue team couldn't understand what they were seeing, Reed said. For people guarding a destroyed fortress against an enemy that was already dead, the team leader asked me why we hadn't tried to signal for help earlier. Reed smiled at the memory. I told him we had been busy, Thane interrupted. What happened to the other survivors? Foster died 2 days after the rescue, Reed said quietly. His wounds were too severe, and he had pushed himself far beyond what his body could handle. Thompson, the communications specialist who had volunteered for the suicide mission, lost her leg but recovered. Martinez's replacement, a young private named Blake, made a full recovery. The human's expression became distant, and then there was me. I spent 6 months in rehabilitation, learning to walk again. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. Reed looked directly at Thane. But I never felt lucky. I felt guilty that I had survived when so many better people had died. The alien commander found himself leaning forward. Why guilty? Because I had moments during the siege when I wanted to give up, Reed admitted. When I was tired, scared, hungry, watching good people die around me. There were times when surrender seemed like the rational choice. Reed's voice became stronger. Every time I thought about quitting, I would see someone like Martinez dying at his post, or Robert sacrificing herself to complete the mission, or Foster fighting from his wheelchair. And I would realize that giving up wasn't really an option. Thane felt his understanding of human nature shifting in ways that made him uncomfortable. You're saying that humans inspire each other to fight beyond rational limits? We inspire each other to be better than we thought we could be, Reed corrected. Sometimes that means fighting. Sometimes it means something else. But it always means refusing to accept that we're helpless. The human doctor stood up again and began pacing slowly around the room. Commander, your analysts want to understand human military capabilities. Here's what you need to know. Our greatest weapon isn't our technology or our tactics. It's our absolute refusal to believe that any situation is hopeless. Reed stopped pacing and faced Thane directly. At Fortress Delta, we were outnumbered, outgunned, poisoned, starving, and dying. By any logical analysis, we should have surrendered on day 1. But we didn't, because humans don't accept defeat until we're physically incapable of continuing. To fight, Thane felt a chill run through his body. And even then, Even then, we try to find a way to keep fighting, Reed confirmed. Roberts was dying when she triggered those explosives. Foster was barely conscious when he led the final assault. Martinez was dead but still at his post. The alien commander realized that his entire understanding of warfare has been based on the assumption that all species would act rationally when facing overwhelming odds. The idea of an enemy that would continue fighting regardless of casualties or chances of victory was terrifying. "This is why you defeated us," Thane said quietly. Reed shook his head. "Commander, you were never defeated. Earth fell, and most of our cities were destroyed. Millions of humans died in the integration conflicts. But you won impossible victories," Thane protested. "Like Fortress Delta. We won some battles by refusing to accept that they were unwinnable," Reed agreed. "But winning individual battles isn't the same as winning a war?" The human sat back down and looked at Thane with an expression the alien couldn't quite read. "The real question is what happens next. Your coalition has control of Earth now. Most humans have accepted integration into your galactic civilization. The fighting is over." Reed paused. "But you're still trying to understand us. Why?" Thane felt his skin patterns shift to show embarrassment. "Because we're afraid of you," Good Reed said simply. "You should be." The alien commander looked up. "Sharply, are you threatening us?" "No," Reed replied. "I'm telling you the truth. Humans are dangerous, not because we're violent or aggressive, but because we don't know how to quit. We'll adapt to any situation, overcome any obstacle, and keep trying to improve our circumstances no matter what you do to stop us." Reed leaned forward. "Commander, your people offered humans a choice. Accept integration into your civilization, or face extinction. Most humans chose integration because it was the logical choice. But do you really think that ends the story?" Thane felt his breathing become shallow. "What do you mean?" "I mean that right now, on every human world under coalition control. There are people like the defenders of Fortress Delta, people who don't accept that the current situation is permanent. People who are quietly working to change things." Reed smiled, and this time it wasn't a sad expression. "We're not planning a rebellion, if that's what you're worried about. We're doing something much more dangerous than that." "What?" Thane asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "We're adapting," Reed said. "We're learning your technology, understanding your politics, studying your weaknesses. We're becoming part of your civilization while remaining fundamentally human." The human doctor stood up one final time. "In 50 years, maybe 100, humans will be so integrated into galactic society that you won't be able to distinguish us from any other species. We'll be your doctors, your engineers, your soldiers, your leaders." Reed walked to the door of the interrogation room, then turned back to face Thane. "And when that day comes, when humans have learned everything we need to know about how your civilization works, we'll start making it better. It's not through war or revolution, but through the same stubborn refusal to accept limitations that kept us fighting at Fortress Delta." The human paused at the door. "You asked me to explain human military capabilities, Commander. You know, we don't fight to win battles. We fight to change the world, and we never ever stop fighting." Reed left the room, leaving Thane alone with his thoughts, and a growing certainty that everything his people thought they knew about humans was dangerously incomplete. The alien commander sat in silence for a long time, staring at the empty chair where Reed had been sitting. Finally, he activated his communication device and began composing an urgent message to Coalition Command. The subject line read, "Immediate policy review required human integration protocols." As he wrote, Thane found himself wondering what his own children would be like if they possessed even a fraction of humanity's terrible, beautiful refusal to accept defeat. He decided he didn't want to find out.